You were never supposed to hear this. Not from me. Not from anyone. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't history. It's the operating code of control, buried under centuries of obedience and silence. You think you live in a free world. You don't. You live inside a gift that was stolen. Once, long before the word civilization meant comfort, it meant debt. The first temples weren't built to worship. They were built to measure what you owed. Wheat, labor, blood. That was the real offering you. Every brick carried your name, erased and rewritten to honor someone else's. The story says the gods gave us paradise. But the truth is darker. Humanity built paradise with its own hands, and then the architects locked the gates. They took the gift we made, our work, our faith, our trust, and cut us out completely. You can still feel it, can't you? That low hum beneath the noise of modern life. The endless cycle of earn, serve, obey. Every system you touch, religion, government, entertainment, still runs on the same ancient code. Gratitude for your own captivity. They call it progress. I call it the long con of history. Because somewhere, in the archives they never let the public see, lies the map of the first control system. It wasn't made of machines, it was made of belief. Every man taught to kneel, every woman taught to please, every child taught to forget. That's how they built it. Not through force, through consent, through centuries of conditioning dressed as love, duty, honor, and we still carry that inheritance like a curse. We celebrate the very powers that excluded us, like children begging to sit at a table we built. That's the real meaning of betrayal. Not when your enemies turn on you, but when your makers do. They took our gift, they took our paradise, and they left us with debt, silence, and obedience, wrapped in the language of freedom. Now tell me, are you ready to remember what they tried to make you forget? Every empire begins with a mirror. The rulers hold it up and say, look, this is you, but it isn't. It's them, reflected through you. That was the first trick of control. Convince the builders they were being protected, when they were only being watched. When the old kingdoms rose from river dust, they discovered something stronger than armies, memory. If you could write the story of a man's past, you could command his future. So they carved laws into stone, hymns into bone, and called it divine order. The people bowed not to swords but to sentences. Generation after generation, the mirror multiplied. The high priests became monarchs, the monarchs became merchants, the merchants became networks, different names, same pulse, feed the system, praise the hand that takes. And while the masses built towers, the architects built narratives. That suffering meant virtue, that obedience meant belonging, that silence meant peace. But silence was never peace, it was programming. They taught men to chase approval instead of power. They taught women to trade intuition for survival. They taught children to dream only inside permitted lines. And the greatest illusion of all, that you could buy your way free, gold, votes, status, screens, each a prettier chain than the last. Somewhere between the temple and the stock exchange, between the altar and the algorithm, the mirror cracked, the reflection began to flicker. A few looked up and saw the edges of the frame, the hands that held it steady. Those hands feared only one thing, awareness. Because once a man sees the mirror, he stops believing in the face. He starts asking who built this, and why was I never invited to my own creation? That question is the fracture line. Every awakening begins there, and once you ask it, you can't go back to sleep. The world isn't ruled by monsters hiding in shadows. It's ruled by systems hiding in plain sight, systems that need your faith more than your fight. So the question becomes, when you saint, giving faith, what happens to their power? Identity was the next design. The old architects learned that if you shape a man's story early enough, you never need chains, you only need mirrors that tell him who he's allowed to be. They discovered fear could be disguised as duty. Love could be molded into obedience. The moment a child asks, "Am I enough?" the system answers, "You will be, when we say so." And from that moment, he stops being free. He becomes performance. Generations later, we inherited that performance as culture. We call it discipline, professionalism, respectability. But beneath the words is the same algorithm: comply first, question later. We build our lives chasing symbols of approval that never fill the hunger they create. Every screen, every title, every dollar becomes another mirror reflecting not who we are, but who we're permitted to appear as. The trick is simple: exhaust the self until it forgets what truth feels like. Once you're tired enough, you'll believe anything that offers comfort. And comfort is how they keep the lights dimmed. People don't notice cages when they're padded. They call them homes, offices, goals. They call the constant performance life. But inside every man there's a fracture, a quiet rebellion that starts as unease. He sits at his desk or in his car or beside someone he's supposed to love, and something whispers, "This can't be it." That whisper is dangerous. It's memory waking up. It's the echo of what you were before the mirrors multiplied. The system calls it discontent. I call it the beginning of vision. Because when you finally listen to that voice, the one that asks who benefits from my exhaustion, the surface starts to crack. Freedom doesn't begin with rebellion. It begins with recognition. Seeing the pattern is the first act of defiance. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. The roles lose weight, the mirrors lose power, and the reflection starts to stare back, not with fear but with understanding. Awareness changes gravity. The moment you see the pattern, the weight of it shifts. What once pressed you down now starts to reveal its structure. Every rule, every expectation, every borrowed dream turns transparent. You realize that power was never taken from you. It was outsourced by habit. The system never needed your chains, it needed your participation. So the first act of reclamation is quiet. You stop feeding what drains you. You stop apologizing for your own clarity. You begin to separate the voice that belongs to you from the ones rehearsed into your mind. It feels small at first, almost invisible, like a breath withheld too long. But that breath changes everything. The builders of the new self don't shout. They observe. They listen until they can tell the difference between instinct and conditioning. Then they act, slowly, precisely. They rebuild routine by choice, not compulsion. They turn silence from submission into strength. Every small refusal to perform becomes a signal. The mirrors no longer define the frame. And when enough individuals reclaim that breath, something collective shifts. The noise loses rhythm. The old patterns begin to falter because their rhythm depends on your repetition. Awareness spreads like light through cracked glass. It doesn't destroy the system, it makes it irrelevant. Freedom isn't a battle. It's withdrawal from illusion. The world doesn't have to collapse for you to walk out of its script. You just have to stop rehearsing the lines written for you. And that's when the mentor's voice fades. Not because the lesson ends, but because it's no longer needed. The echo becomes your own. There comes a moment when silence feels different. It's no longer the silence of obedience, but of presence. The noise of borrowed voices fades, and what remains is something raw. Your own pulse, steady and unshaken. That's the sound of returning. The old systems don't vanish. They keep whispering, offering comfort, identity, belonging. But once you have seen them, their promises taste hollow. You recognize their rhythm as hunger disguised as hope. And you stop feeding it. You walk through the same streets, sit among the same people, but everything has shifted. The world didn't change. You did. You no longer measure yourself by mirrors or worth by approval. You see the machinery and choose not to turn its gears. That choice, quiet and unseen, is the purest act of rebellion. Power, you realize, was never in control. It was in awareness. They took your gift, and you believed it was gone. But the gift was never theirs to keep. It lived in the hands that built, in the breath that remembered. And now, the circle closes. The paradise they stole was never a place. It was a state of being. You step back into it not by conquest but by clarity. The story doesn't end with revenge. It ends with recognition. The lesson is simple. You cannot be cut out of what you've already become. You were the builder. You were the gift. And now, finally, you are home.